All right, good morning. So nice to see you all here on this soon-to-be sunny November morning. This is the Baltic Breakfast. It's arranged by Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center, and I am Ellen Bruno. I will be moderating this session today. And today we will talk about plastic, fantastic plastic, maybe, or maybe not so fantastic, and about a new global treaty that's on its way, hopefully. And it's a big thing because it's the first. And as always, we will start with two presentations. They are 50 minutes each, and I will be the one asking the questions, and you guys, you'll hold on to your questions. Also you who join us on link. You can send your questions afterwards or meanwhile to Slido, code 22102, or just follow the instructions. And remember, guys, there are no silly questions. If you are thinking about something, there's probably a neighbor next to you thinking about the same question. So please be brave. And to help me today, I have two excellent researchers. It's Patricia Villarrubia-Gómez. You are at Stockholm Resilience Center here at Stockholm University, and a PhD student. And Fredric Bauer, you are, let me see, Associate Senior Lecturer at Technology and Society at Lund University. Cool, very good. And I will start with you, Patricia, because you're actually leaving for Korea this Sunday, right? So you will be taking care of the negotiations and everything. So we will learn more from you on what's happening. So take it away.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Patricia, you can call me Patty, and today I'm going to be talking about the plastics pollution, a comprehensive story. I'm starting my PhD, I'm finalizing in a year at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, and I would like to talk to you today about the not so well-known history of plastics, or more than that, the narrative about plastics. And I have been researching about plastic for 10 years, and one of the things that it got my attention is how do we talk about the problem with plastics? And more in the context of the negotiations that are ongoing, I realized that we consider plastic as a waste problem that is created by poor countries with poor littering behavior, and that it's very easy to recycle and clean up and get out of the mess. And still we are talking about that that plastics are safe and that the social benefits still exceed the potential impact. But however, this is a misleading narrative that is only looking into the end of the life cycle of plastics. And this is important because 88% of the financial capital that is put to solve plastic problems goes to waste management and recycling. So, however, I prefer to look at plastic in this way. The plastic problem starts right at the extraction and production of it, and it goes all the way up to the whole full life cycle until plastic is, for instance, in the marine environment where phytoplankton cannot work as they do normally. We can see here, because we're in the Baltic Sea talks, right? We know that plastic are impacting the ocean we have plastic all over the ocean, but also it's impacting livelihoods of fishermen, and it's also having more deep earth system processes impact, and I will talk about that later. And it's important to know that, for instance, plastic impact climate change, and Fredric will be talking about that later on, but 96% of all greenhouse gas emissions occur at the extraction and production. So for me, I'm part of my research, I'm looking into plastics and the planetary boundaries, and for those who are not aware of what the planetary boundaries are, it's a sustainability framework that started in 2009, where they define 9 of the major problems that society has to face today on the Anthropocene. And it has different iterations of knowledge, and they define these 9 problems like climate change, stratospheric ozone layer, ocean acidification, water, and chemicals, novel entities. And I'm studying the novel entities one. We know that from 2009, 3 of these boundaries were crossed, and now in 2024, we know that 6 of them are crossed. And I'm studying the novel entities, which is the one that, sorry, I didn't mention that for establishing these planetary boundaries, they look at what are the concentrations or limits where plastic has, where these environmental problems have been like safe within the safe operating space based on Holocene like state for 10,000 years. But in the case of chemicals, they are new. Novel entities are new. Novel entities are all those chemicals that are human-made produced, but also those natural elements that are transported on the Earth system in ways that are not normally transported, like heavy metals and other entities. When it comes to novel entities, we know that because of the different the big diversity, the major production of quantities produced, and our incapacity to regulate and monitor them, because so much is produced so fast, we know that for novel entities, we are outside this safe operating space. So what I have done for part of my PhD is trying to connect plastics as these novel entities to what are the impacts on other planetary boundaries. And for the sake of time, I will just explain climate change. And because what we know is that all impacts are interconnected. So we know from literature review and a synthesis of knowledge, we know that plastic has an impact on climate change, through albedo, through carbon sequestration, and through greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the direct impacts. But at the same time, these impacts on climate change can also trigger changes in ocean acidification. But what happens when plastic has an impact on other major planetary boundaries? How is plastic impacting climate change from an indirect way? So we know that the story gets much more complicated when we look into these knock-on effects interaction. And we know that land system change, it also has alterations in the biochemical flows, and so on. And I have done this exercise with every single one of the planetary boundaries, and the result has been this. So as a conclusion, we can see that plastic has an evidence impact to all planetary boundaries, that plastic may are having a disruption on Earth system processes, and that all the planetary boundaries that we know and we have put limits on may have been exacerbated in a major way that we know of right now because we are not considering this. So another thing is that planetary boundaries, as I said before, they put a limit to a limit or a threshold that we cannot cross, but it's like one number, one limit. And in the case of novel entities, this is not possible. So when we look at plastic pollution, we have to look at it from a social ecological point of view, in which this very complex system has to be looked at business level, at a society level, and this is very, very important when we talk about policy and the global treaty. I'm also part of the Scientist Coalition for an effective plastics treaty, and I will be talking about that just in a few minutes. But this is a report that some of my colleagues produced for also last year for the treaty negotiations to know more about it. And we know that plastics are composed of more than 16,000 different chemicals. And we only have information about those about hazardous, about 1%. And only 1% of these chemicals are internationally are part of international governance. We have no much data about what are the hazardous chemicals, what do these hazardous chemicals does. And we have no data for more than 10,000 of these chemicals. And this is very important because when we talk about plastics, as I said before, we need to talk about the whole system. We have to talk about the chemicals because that is what it having the impacts on the environment and people. So when we talk about plastics from now on, I would like you to think about more of this rather than the first picture I put. People are getting impacted directly from the extraction of fossil fuels and fossil fuels, and up to one plastics is having impact in Earth system processes like, as I said, albedo. So why this is so important in the content of the global treaty? So the global treaty was mandated to take place on UNEA 5.2 in 2022 in Resolution 514. And in this mandate, they were saying that we have to have a full life cycle of plastics, we have to protect human rights and human health and the environment, and we have to be informed by best available science, including the expertise of indigenous people, knowledge systems, and others like WEC speakers. This treaty is supposed to occur and take place within 2 years. We are here in INC 5 in Busan, South Korea, and I'm going to be going and be part of the scientist coalition to follow and inform policymakers. But there are very strong voices saying that we have to finish the treaty by now, at the end of the year, but it's unclear if this is going to happen because of the reasons that I'm going to show you now. So the main treaty elements, these are the topics and the issues that the text right now contemplate. But even though you can see only like 10 of them, this is very complicated and every single word is contested in this treaty. Why? Because fossil fuels, because plastic is fossil fuels, it's taken into place. And there are many different coalitions of countries of how this is being negotiated. So we have a polarization between the most ambitious countries that have collided in the high ambition coalition, that it's over 66 countries. And we have a few voices that they are very few, but very loud, that are they're blocking conversations and substantive matters about plastics. Some of the things that are being contested are human health, that plastic have no impact on human health, microplastics, and the impacts of microplastics in the environment, or human rights. What are human rights within the treaty? What it's meaning? And we have a very big bunch on the middle that they are in between. They don't know yet where are they going to position it. So there are very strong voices, and most of the countries really want a big treaty to protect the environment and people. But still, we are like in between, and we don't know what is going to happen. And this is what science comes to. Me as a scientist, I ask myself, what can I do? Because I have tried everything. I have tried to go plastic-free. I have tried to reduce absolutely my contact with plastic, and it's impossible because the system doesn't work. So at individual level, I couldn't. So what can I do at a bigger level, at the global scale? So we created a coalition of scientists. We started 5. I was happy to be one of the first 5 members who went to the INC1. Thank you to Naturskyddsföreningen, that was the institution that sponsored me, and Oceanborn Foundation, who allowed me to go there with a grant. And we were 5. To INC 5, we are going to go 71. And many more will be working with us from home. In the Scientist Coalition, we are now more than 400 with from 70 different countries, and we speak many, many languages. So our role is to get all the science, all the evidence we have, which are peer review, and bring that information directly to the negotiators. That's what we do. We don't do anything else that inform negotiators and everyone who wants to know about plastic pollution, about what is happening, and try to unblur all the confusion that there is, because there are a lot. There is a lot of disinformation, and there are a lot of like vested interests that would not allow going there. And I have to say, because we are in Sweden, and I finish, I promise, the Swedish government has been, the Swedish delegation has been extremely good. I'm extremely impressed of how approachable they are and how good they are prepared for this, because not all negotiators really have a knowledge about plastic pollution while negotiating a treaty on plastic pollution. So I'm really grateful for that.
Here.
Okay.
Cool. So you have been also doing research on how science is taken into account when these negotiations are going on. So what's your feeling? Do they, like you said now, the Swedish delegation care, but has science been a part of the treaty, the texts? Have you been able to influence them, or how does it work?
So that is a quite complicated question, because one of the things that we are looking at, and we have been looking at in environmental scientists for the longest, is does more knowledge translates into more action and better policies? And it's not always the case, because, as I said, there are many vested interests, like fossil fuels and big companies, as we can see what is happening in Baku and what happened last week or 2 weeks ago in Colombia in the COP. So we have seen a very big drift from the conversations we were having in INC1, where chemicals and human health and climate change were not on the table, not really, to now there are a lot of these conversations, so much so that there is push from those that don't want that to be in.
So you would say it's a good thing actually that you have a clear coalition also with those that don't want to go with a high ambition.
Yeah.
Now you know what's on stake.
And we have received feedback from many of the countries that we have collaboration that we informed to, and they said that the coalition of scientists, that there are more scientists that are not part of our coalition, but that the scientist coalition has been pivotal to get where we are right now in the matter of informing negotiators.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Fredric. Okay, when I asked you to come, I was thinking, plastic, you burn plastic, and that create climate gases. And then you came and you have another message. So please give us to that.
Yeah, so can you hear me decently? Yeah, brilliant. So I'm Fredric Bauer. I'm an associate senior lecturer in technology and society. You're not here. The mic's not picking
Bring
up.
Bring it up a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, brilliant. So all the way from Lund, happy to be here this morning. And I was asked to talk a bit about, well, what's then the connection between plastics and climate change? What do we know? What has our research in my group and with our collaborations shown? And what sort of the state-of-the-art knowledge about the connections between plastics and climate change in the world? So I thought I'd start from the beginning, because that's usually a good place to start. And as Patricia already mentioned, plastics are fossil fuels, right? But what does this mean? Well, basically it means that we use oil and gas fractions, particularly naphtha that comes from the oil refineries, or so-called gas condensates, natural gas liquids, ethane from the US shale gas extraction. And we feed them into so-called crackers, steam crackers, where we heat these hydrocarbons to about 900 degrees C, a temperature so high that the molecules actually break, right? They crack. And then we get small molecules, small building blocks that we then sort of connect together in polymerization, and then we get sort of polymers, which is what we commonly call plastics. But before we have plastics products, you know, the ones that we know, the bags, the straws, the textile fibers and our clothes, the interior panels for our cars. We also mix these polymers with a lot of different additives of different types and sorts for different reasons. But really, we use a lot of oil for this, right? We use about 14% of all the oil in the world in the chemicals industry, in the petrochemicals industry, and plastics is the single largest and single most product category within that industry. So it's a lot of oil that goes into this, and also a lot of gas. And global production is quite unevenly distributed. The sort of chemicals and plastics industries used to be really big and important in Europe and the US, North America and Japan for a long time. But in the new millennium, so over the past 20 years, this has really shifted. So instead of a sort of Western dominance, we are now seeing a very sort of strong Asian dominance in this sector, with China having become the single largest producer of plastics in the world, with about a third of global production capacity. And also a lot of growth in Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific. And this is important because we have seen production growing in the regions that are most dependent on fossil energy, right? And in particular on coal, meaning that over time, production on average has in fact become dirtier. It has become associated with greater emissions of greenhouse gases because it's now more dependent on coal than it used to be. But also global consumption is very unevenly distributed, right? As is all material consumption. This is not specific to plastics, but basically the wealthier we are, the more material resources we use and consume, right? Because we can, because it's convenient, because it's comfortable for us to do so. But that means that you and I and everyone here sort of in Sweden, on average, in Northwestern Europe, consume about 150 kilograms of plastic per person and year. Sort of double the average weight of a Swede, right? And that's not just packaging. And but I mean, to start with, that's far more than the majority of people in the world, right? The global average is about 60 kilograms per person and year. So we consume about 2.5 times more than the global average. The US sort of stands out at around 250 kilos, and I don't know what they do to reach that number. Huge cars and all of that, you know, right? But we really use plastics for so many different things. And we tend to talk about plastic as if it's one thing, but it's a lot of different things, right? We use it, of course, we use it for packaging, but that's the single largest application domain, but it's not even the majority of plastics. It's about 35% or so of all plastics we use for packaging. Then we also use a lot of plastics nowadays in construction and buildings and infrastructure. We use a lot of plastics in textiles. So the majority, almost 2/3 of all textile fibers in the world are by now synthetic, i.e. plastics. Polyester is the single most common textile fiber in the world, right? So that's about 15% of textiles. Then, unfortunately, not in this chart, because for non-explainable historical reasons, textile fibers are statistically reported very differently. Still haven't met anyone who could explain why. So we use it in basically all aspects of our everyday life, all sectors of the economy, and we talk about it as if they're one thing, but there really are a lot of different plastics. And we can talk about the sort of commodity ones, the most important ones. There are about 8 types of polymers that constitute about 75 to 80% of the global consumption of plastics. So that's really the majority of them. But when we then consider all the different qualities and grades that can be produced with these polymers, we end up at several thousand types of plastics, right? But what we know is that we have environmental impacts throughout the entire life cycle of plastics. And if we're talking about climate change specifically, we see it primarily in resource extraction and production and manufacture. So when we drill and explore and extract oil and gas, the materials that we use to produce plastics, which are also the energy sources used to produce them, and in the polymer production, right? When we produce the plastics, that's when we have the majority of emissions. But then what about waste, right? And we know that in Sweden we incinerate a lot of our waste. We're decent at recycling, but when it comes to plastic, that ends up at less than 10% of the plastic waste. And about 80% or 85% or so is incinerated. So that's a lot of emissions. And you would expect, as Ellen did when she asked me to come, that that's where we would have the main greenhouse gas emissions. But on a global level, that's actually not so, simply because most plastic waste is still landfilled in the world, right? So yes, this is significant in Sweden and in a few other countries that have very large infrastructure for waste incineration. But on a global level, it's completely the greenhouse gas emissions from the plastic value chain is completely dominated by the sourcing of raw materials and production of plastics. And that's because of the very, very high energy intensity of the production and all the emissions associated with resource extraction. And as you see, even though plastics are primarily produced from oil and gas derivatives, a fair share of the impact comes from coal, and that's because of all the energy used that in parts of the world comes from coal. So we see this lock-in in the plastics value chain that is locked into fossil dependency and fossil technologies. And that goes all the way from production with the technologies that have been developed for using fossil fuels for a very long time, in terms of market demand, where we have grown accustomed to certain types of behavior, certain forms of consumption, where we now take the plastic part of that for granted. In waste management, where we have built and adapted our waste management structures and waste incineration plants to deal with a lot of plastic waste. In the industry organization, where basically the plastic industry is a completely integrated part of the fossil fuel industry. To policy and governance, which for a long time has been fairly weak when it comes to regulating fossil fuels, chemicals, and plastics. And this has, to a very large degree, been left to sort of self-regulation by the industry. So what can we do then? How can we envision change in a world like this? Well, there are things that we can do, pathways forward. We can sort of reuse, reduce, and partly substitute our plastic use, but we cannot substitute all of it, right? That's a fallacy to think that, oh, if we only sort of then substitute the plastics for something else, then problem solved, right? And partly that's very difficult because of the specific material characteristics of the plastics that we want in particular types of products, but also because other materials are not without environmental impacts, right? So to a large degree, reducing our stresses on the environment, reducing our impact on climate change is about reducing material consumption in our societies, plastics and others, right? We can think about bio-based and alternative feedstocks to sort of substitute part of this flow of fossil fuels, and that could be new types of bio-based polymers, for example, or captured carbon from different types of resources. And that can make up for parts of the production, but extremely unlikely a majority of current production, or we would see significant impacts on land use and energy use, and so on and so forth. And we can work for more circular economies, recycle and circulate in different ways and different forms. But again, you know, the idea of 100% circularity is a fallacy, right? It's sort of thermodynamically impossible, and also practically, right? We will have losses. We will need to sort of accommodate for that in different ways and forms. So all of these are sort of pieces to the puzzle rather than single bullet solutions or silver bullet solutions. But we can also note that there are strong synergies between interventions for climate change mitigation and plastic pollution. But we have to note that to align with the net zero targets, the Paris Agreement that we have international agreement upon, we have to reduce primary production of plastics. The sort of business as usual scenarios point towards continued growth rates of 3 or 4%, and there's just no way that aligns with what we know is necessary to align with international climate targets. And so there are actually great synergies to be developed here, pointed towards by us, but also others such as the OECD. And yet we have to remember that when we're thinking about this, when we're talking about a circular economy as one part of the solution, others, one of the most important consultancies in the world to this industry, are thinking about a very different question, namely, how can a circular plastics economy grow the oil industry, right? So that's part of the sort of conflict and contestation that also Patty referenced in this global treaty space. We're seeing this sort of everywhere, in the climate negotiations, in the plastics treaty negotiations, in the business field, where we're also seeing very different competing interests among international firms and international corporations. So a lot to think about and a lot to be cautious about, but also reasons to be hopeful about what's going to be happening in Busan in Korea in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Okay, you left us on quite a tough note.
I try to be positive.
So, if they don't agree, what can I do?
What can we do as individuals? Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? In a way, there's very little we can do. It's very difficult to, and I would say, in many ways, not very meaningful to think that this is about individuals transforming to plastic-free lives, because this is not about one type of consumption. It's really about how our modern economies work, because plastics are everywhere, right? It's in our clothes, it's in our cars, it's in our trains. So it's not just about switching from private cars to public transport. That's a good thing for climate change mitigation, but that doesn't sort of get rid of plastics for us. But one thing that we can do is sort of reduce our material consumption in general. That has a very, very strong positive impact on climate change, biodiversity loss, and basically all types of environmental impacts associated with material resource use.
Okay, well, that was so no shopping, guys. Yeah, please, Patricia and Fredric, join me. Now it's the time for all your brilliant and never silly questions. And meanwhile, I'll let you also answer, Patricia, because you also had strong ideas on this. What can I do, and what shouldn't I do?
So I can only say what I have been trying to do, and I try to go plastic free for 2 years while living here in Sweden, and another year that I went into Norway. I completely try to avoid anything that plastic that touch my food, because plastic packaging leakage has a leakage of chemicals to the food. That's proven. You can go to the food packaging forum and read about it. And I was also a vegetarian, trying to do my best for the environment, and I became anemic. Because there is no way we can eat without plastic touching our food as the system it is. So I have done my best, and sometimes my best is not good for my economy. And I'm privileged, I live in Sweden and I don't have children. But if I would be a mother of 2 in Spain or another country, I would not be able to afford going plastic free, because everything that is cheaper has more plastics. So the system has to change. I would avoid drinking as much as possible from water bottle. I can. There's evidence that there are more microplastics in water bottle than in tap water, and we have a wonderful water here in Sweden. I don't understand why we have to do bottled water. So we can do some things, but just as Fredric was saying, it's about changing the system. It's not about changing. We cannot do anything individually, I'm sorry, but I have tried for 10 years and talking to many people that do it, and it's complicated.
Okay, I'll continue.
Yeah.
So what would be like your... I know you kind of think that it's going to be difficult negotiations, but what kind of like text would you like to come out from it? Like what would be a great outcome? I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would love to see in the text that we have essentiality on the uses of plastics and chemicals, because not all the chemicals are needed, according to many of my scientist colleagues. I would love to see that science is really listened to, and when I say science, I also include like indigenous people's knowledge and the expertise from waste speakers. And I would love to have a robust treaty in which we say that we have to reduce the production, and we put the earth and people first. That's basically. I don't know if you have.
No, I mean, I think we're fairly aligned, and I think some form of, if we want to narrow it down to essentiality, we'll talk about priority areas for plastics use in the future. I think that's necessary if we, or would be necessary if we were to take the challenge of reducing global primary production and consumption seriously, and to align with the climate targets we really do, right? And that means that we would have to rethink many forms of consumption today, but also probably prioritize the plastics that we need for essential or very important infrastructure development for the energy transition and the rollout of modern infrastructure in many developing economies around the world, for example.
Gun?
Yeah, can I ask a question? I'm Gun Rudqvist, also a colleague of Ellen. I was just interested in you describe the processes of producing plastics. What about changing that kind of production, reducing the environmental impacts from that production? What's the potential there?
Absolutely, there are different sort of technological pathways for doing that. I mean, I talked about these sort of three overarching pathways, but we can also see different forms of technologies being tried and tested to mitigate some of the climate change impacts and other forms of environmental impacts from production. That would be, for example, electrifying these steam crackers. So instead of running them on gas or fuel oils, running them on electricity, preferably then renewable electricity. Otherwise, it's a lose-lose. If that would be coal-based electricity, right? That still does not help us mitigate the problem of the plastics themselves being fossil fuels, and the problems associated with the extraction and processing of those fossil fuels, and also at end of life, because 100% circularity is impossible. Most likely we will continue to see incineration. Hopefully, a sort of seeing incineration taking a less important role in the future as a way of treating plastic waste, but still we will probably need it to get rid of plastics that we know are dangerous, that we have been producing for the past 70 years, to get rid of like high-risk waste and so on and so forth, right? So unless we get rid of the fossil component, we're still in a pickle.
Thank you for great presentations. I'm Marcus Landstedt, and I work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where Patricia works as well. So I will direct my question to you, Fredric. If I were to grant you, say, $1 billion in a research grant, what will be the major research frontier where you'll be exploring further, and what do you hope to find?
$1 billion, that's a lot of money in a personal research grant, right? No, but I think, you know, there are many things that need to be done and to be investigated further, and for sure looking at different types of technological solutions is important. I have, over the past few years, been quite intrigued by and sort of used a lot of my time to look at, well, how does this industry operate? How is it structured? What do the sort of capital structures and flows look like? Digging further into the subsidies that fuel expansion in this industry, because there's a lot of public funding and a lot of public subsidies actually supporting the continued expansion of plastics production. That's something that I'm quite intrigued by, for example. So yes, there are things to do both sort of in the realm of technology development, understanding the sort of social structures that uphold this industry and its projected growth. And rethinking all sort of economic analysis to think about, well, what incentive structures, for example, could work in different parts of the economy, in different regions of the world, to redefine how many sectors work.
Okay, I'm going to grab on the C. Here. Okay, we'll start here.
Hi, I'm Ingela Bäckström. I have a short question to Fredric. The last slide about McKinsey wanting to have the industry to grow. How old is that saying? When was it stated?
So it's Wood Mackenzie, and I think this is a report they published 2019.
Okay, thank you.
It's a few years old, but
would they still do the same? Do they still have the contract to do that?
I don't want to sort of speak for them. But
okay,
let's say,
I
mean, they remain one of the most important consultancy and information providers in this industry.
Okay, I'm going to take the last question that we always take. So if you're a policymaker, let's say Swedish, you got some real power. What would be your contribution, or how would you try to solve this problem? Like the Prime Minister says, I want you to do something about the plastic problem. What are you going to do? Fredric?
Let's...
Patricia?
No, I think that exactly what we have been saying here. Stop subsidizing and try our best to reduce the production of primary polymers, and instead of going for what are the best substitution that we can get, meaning trying to substitute this plastic, fossil fuel plastic, for this compostable plastic, just like how can we just get rid of plastic that we don't need and try to go back to not having as much plastic. Plastic is great, but it's toxic in many ways, and it's not needed in many others. So I would put my efforts on how can we have a better future in which we use a good material for what it's needed and not use it when it's not needed.
Okay. Use less plastic.
And look at the chemicals.
Look at the chemicals. Clean plastics.
Yeah.
All right, Fredrik.
Yeah, so Sweden. This is I don't know. I don't think this is a Swedish issue in many ways. Sort of internationally, Sweden is quite peripheral market for this industry. We have one major plastic producer in Sweden on the west coast. So I don't think sort of aiming for production restrictions in Sweden would make a sort of significant impact on the global dynamics that we're talking about here today. But of course, there are things that we can do and we should do, and I think it's important to not give up the idea of first mover advantage that we have been pushing in Sweden for a long time, right? Progressive environmental policies that can then also inspire others. So, there are a lot of good initiatives pushing towards more circularity, and the Delegation for a Circular Economy has many good proposals. So, really pushing the most progressive ones there, even though they're difficult, to show what can be done and inspire the rest of the EU and hopefully the rest of the world as well.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for joining. Thank you all for your questions and your engagement in this quite complicated question. I have a feeling it's more complicated now than it was before. I wanted to say that the next Baltic Breakfast is on the 18th of December, and it's about fish health at the Christmas table. So please join then. And until then, go out and do what you're best at, saving the world. And thank you very much for today.
Thank you.